There is a photograph I keep in my mind, a river in spring, swollen and dark, carrying with it a page of a poem one moment, and the next, a scrap of burned cloth. Imagine those two things floating together, ink and ash, until they vanish beneath the current. That image has followed me through archives, across excavation reports, and into the quiet rooms where families still remember what their grandmothers would not speak aloud. What I want to argue is blunt and uncomfortable. The Mongol campaigns of the 13th century were not mere episodes of sporadic violence. They were an integrated system of cultural destruction in which captive women were often singled out as instruments of assimilation and erasure. This system combined slaughter, displacement, forced unions, slavery, and the targeted removal of knowledge bearers in ways that produced consequences visible even now in the genetic and material record. If this subject matters to you, stay with me to the end. Subscribe and like so that these buried stories keep finding audiences. There is a case to make here, and the evidence is scattered across chronicles, bones, buried manuscripts, and, increasingly, the language of DNA. I will walk you through what I and others have come to see as 5 interlocking tactics that produced cultural erasure. For each, I will offer what the sources show, what archaeologists and geneticists have found, and a brief human vignette to keep the consequences visible and human. First, the tactic I call biological replacement. Contemporary chroniclers, Persian historians such as Ata Malik Juvaini and the compilers of the Secret History of the Mongols, record, in different tones and with different agendas, the movement of peoples across vast spaces. They describe campaigns that left populations decimated, survivors taken, and captives redistributed. Some modern genetic surveys have given this a new and controversial angle. A Y chromosome lineage that geneticists have argued traces back to a common ancestor in the Mongol imperial heartland appears at unusually high frequencies across a broad swath of Eurasia. Careful scholars emphasize uncertainty. Lineages can spread for many reasons, but the pattern is suggestive of an extraordinary demographic impact. What does that look like at ground level? Imagine a provincial town after a siege. The walls are dark with soot, the market is a lattice of broken stalls. Men lie where they fell or are missing, having been killed or conscripted or scattered. Women and children are rounded up. Some are sold at market, some are given to allied commanders as wives or concubines, others are forced into households where they bear children who will grow up in a different tongue. The result over generations can be a demographic shift in the male line, one of the mechanisms by which identity is slowly reframed. A vignette. A woman named Mariam. This is a composite, a plausible reconstruction rather than a named person in a chronicle, was a teacher of poetry in a small city that is now a field. After the siege, forced into a household of newcomers, she taught her daughter to recite a verse in the old tongue. Her daughter's children grew up speaking another language. The lineage of names on the family line ended. The memory of that regional idiom faded. Mariam's story, repeated in hundreds of towns, becomes a vector for linguistic and cultural shift. The violence is not only what happened in the moment, it is the living arrangement afterward that steers the next generation. Second, public humiliation as policy. Several medieval chroniclers recount rituals intended to shatter local social cohesion. Public executions, displays of heads, and the exposure of elites were not merely about killing opponents. They were psychological instruments. Beyond those more visible acts, humiliation took other forms. Stripping the garments of status, forcing men to perform tasks at which they had never worked, and parading captives through marketplaces as proof of conquest. Sources record that conquerors recognized honor systems as sources of resistance. To break a society, you needed to break its sense of dignity. Archaeologists corroborate the scale of these episodes. Excavation reports note layers of burning in public squares, shattered monumental inscriptions, and the rapid abandonment of elite houses. When an administrative center is symbolically destroyed, its records burned, its libraries looted, the means by which a culture transmits knowledge and status are disrupted. The social architecture of honor dissolves into fragments.
A brief scene. At dawn, a magistrate is dragged across the central square. He is made to kneel, his robes are set alight and then snuffed out. The crowd watches, uncertain whether to feel relief or terror. As the new order establishes itself, the magistrate's sons are given menial tasks. Their children do not learn the legal language their forefathers used. The humiliation is contagious. It remakes social expectation and erodes institutions that once guarded cultural continuity. Third, the use of human shields and forced labor, karash and related practices, where captives were used as tools in campaigns and sieges. Contemporary accounts use blunt terms. Captives marched ahead of siege engines, conscripted into labor projects, or positioned where their deaths could be leveraged to pressure resisting populations. This calculus converted human bodies into military instruments and, crucially, redistributed populations under coercive oversight. Material traces of these movements persist. Mass graves, organized labor structures, and settlement patterns that abruptly change after conquest point to systematic displacement. Traders' ledgers, where they survive, show an increased flow of captives towards certain hubs. Slave markets appear as nodes in a logistical network. People were commodities, in the economic sense, moved along routes that tied the new imperial core to the newly subdued peripheries. One vignette. A caravan of captives, thin from the road, is held overnight in a walled compound. An old woman who once taught children to read astronomical tables is placed under the shelter of a lean-to. A trader inspects children for health and vigor, calculating their value. Nearby, a commander arranges to send a group of women to a distant province to become part of the household of a newly appointed governor. The old woman is taken
with others, sent farther from all she knew. She is not killed, she is relocated. Her knowledge survives only insofar as she can pass it on within a very different household. But the social context that framed that knowledge, the schools, the patronage, the marketplaces, is gone. These first three mechanisms, biological replacement, public humiliation, and forced displacement of people as labor and shields, work together to fragment communities. But the system remained incomplete without the markets and networks that monetized human lives, and without the deliberate attack on the keepers of yearning. Those are the next acts, and they complete the architecture of erasure. Fourth, the forced migration and slave trade. Siege after siege produced captives who entered structured channels, caravans, markets, and diplomatic gifts. The logistics were not chaotic alone. They became routinized. Captives were valued differently, some as domestic servants, some as concubines, some as laborers for agricultural estates far from home. The dispersal of populations across regions was not accidental. It was the mechanism by which languages, crafts, and familial lineage were dispersed and absorbed. Economically, this reshuffling served several functions. It rewarded soldiers and commanders, fed markets with labor, and integrated conquered lands into broader imperial economies. Every woman moved against her will might become a childbearer in a new household, producing bicultural descendants whose identities would complicate and often dilute the original national or tribal affiliations. The archival traces are variably precise. Merchants' accounts, legal petitions from captives or their descendants, and regional demographic anomalies suggest an upheaval of ordinary life. Consider a merchant ledger from a caravan town. Names listed, ages given, prices negotiated across a range. The entries are clinical. They might list a group of women from X sold or transferred to a governor in the steppe. The ledger itself is a mute witness to the commodification of lives, and to the regularity of human traffic that, taken over decades, alters demography and culture. Fifth, the targeted elimination of knowledge bearers. The scholars, poets, religious leaders, and scribes who were the living libraries of their communities. When a city's scholars are killed, enslaved, or dispersed, the cumulative effect on memory is enormous. Chroniclers describe the destruction of libraries and the slaughter of learned men and women.
Archaeological layers reveal burned libraries, scattered manuscript fragments, and empty lecture spaces. The loss is not only loss of books, it is the removal of pedagogy, the rupture of teacher-student lineages, the break in oral tradition. Baghdad's fall in 1258 has become the emblematic case for this tactic. Chroniclers of diverse sympathies record a catastrophic dismantling of institutions that had been nodes of learning for centuries. Manuscripts were thrown into rivers, according to some accounts, and scholars were deported, executed, or otherwise silenced. Whether every detail is literal or emblematic matters to historians debating precise methods. But the pattern is unmistakable. Attacking knowledge centers accelerates cultural erasure. A short, dignified vignette. A librarian, hands ink-stained, stands beneath the collapsed beams of a teaching hall. He has hidden a roll of verse in
his robe. When the new household carries him away, he can recite the poem, but cannot teach it in its original metrical context. Later generations will hear the verse in a different tongue, its original cadences lost. It is not only a personal tragedy, it is, incrementally, a structural death of a tradition. All 5 acts together produce compound effects. The story is not just that cities burned or people died. It is that the mechanisms of cultural reproduction, marriage practices, public rights, schooling systems, languages used in trade and law, were disrupted in ways that favored assimilation and, over generations, the disappearance of distinctive cultural signifiers. Genetic studies that identify dominant male lineages across vast regions are a strange kind of corollary. They suggest demographic patterns consistent with mass movements and male line reproductive success. Archaeological ash layers and abandoned workshops are the material counterpart. Chronicles, for all their bias and rhetorical aims, provide the narrative scaffolding that shows intent and practice. Throughout this process, there were survivors who resisted in small ways. Mothers who taught children in secret, scribes who copied aloud by lantern light, elders who insisted on marking ceremonies. Those acts of cultural preservation mattered. They created pockets of continuity that sometimes, against the odds, allowed languages to endure, poems to be remembered, and lineages of knowledge to persist in altered form. But there is another thing to reckon with: moral intentionality. Were these outcomes the result of a coherent, centrally planned program to erase cultures, or were they the cumulative result of military logic, opportunistic exploitation, and the incentives of conquest? The record suggests both. Imperial commanders often rewarded resettlement and exploitation. Policies enabled the transfer of populations, and some chroniclers boast of the transformative scope of their campaigns. Yet contingency was real. Local commanders, weather, and logistics shaped outcomes. Our task is to show that, regardless of whether there was a single blueprint, the combination of tactics created an operational system that functioned like a machine of erasure. When historians, geneticists, and archaeologists bring their disparate data to the same table, an uneasy concordance emerges. Geneticists speak cautiously, a pattern consistent with, estimates suggest, and they emphasize the need for more data. Archaeologists map layers and dates, noting destruction horizons and subsequent resettlement. Chroniclers narrate violence with their own moral and political agendas. Together, their converging testimony supports the thesis that what happened in the 13th century had systemic qualities that extended beyond immediate conquest. This is not a tale meant to cast every descendant of those centuries with simple blame. It is intended to show how power, war, and human economies colluded in patterns that, over time, extinguished languages, gutted institutions, and made whole communities into fragments. The moral urgency is in the aftermath, remembering what was lost, acknowledging suffering that echoes in family traditions, and guarding against forgetting. I close this segment with an image I encountered in a ruined library report. A layer of ash so fine it coated pages that had been hastily stacked. The letters, "The ash preserved an outline of what had been. It is a residue of destruction that paradoxically preserves a trace. There is a reason we read those traces with care. They remind us that erasure is rarely complete, and that memory survives in the smallest of relics, marginalia, a whispered stanza, the recipe a grandmother still remembers. That was only part of the story. Next, we will move through the mechanisms of evidence in greater detail, how geneticists map lineages, how markets integrated human lives into imperial economies, and how memory has been pieced together from fragments of pottery and fragments of verse. The work of reconstruction is slow, and it demands both diligence and compassion. Geneticists begin their maps where the soil yields a bone or a tooth that still holds a fragment of the past. In laboratories the size of libraries, technicians coax fragments of ancient molecules into telling stories. Which alleles cluster together, which lineages disperse down male lines, which maternal threads persist in surprising continuity. The tools are many: whole genome sequencing of ancient remains, targeted capture of single nucleotide polymorphisms, statistical models that estimate admixture and ancestry proportions across time. Isotopic analysis of the same teeth and bones supplies another axis. Signatures of childhood landscapes, water sources, diets that betray early mobility. Together, these threads allow researchers to propose scenarios, ranges of likelihood rather than certainties, about who moved where, when, and in what numbers. But those scenarios arrive with built-in cautions. Samples are rarely evenly distributed. Burial practices, preservation conditions, and excavation histories bias the record towards certain places, social strata, and sexes. Elite tombs yield DNA more often than unmarked graves. Urban deposits preserve more fragments than transient camps. Statistical models interpolate between points, and the language of the field properly remains tentative, consistent with, compatible with, probable. Moreover, genetic signals can be produced by multiple social processes. A pronounced signature associated with one region could reflect the movement of a small, reproductively successful warrior elite. It could reflect long-term settlement by mixed households. It could reflect the recruitment of women into new kin networks through marriage and concubinage. In short, genes trace demographic contours, but not the intentions that drove them. Interpreting those contours demands integration with texts, material culture, and the economics that made those movements intelligible to contemporaries. Markets were one of the engines that translated conquest into everyday life. Roads and ports that once served trade also served removal and resettlement. Marketplaces that sold grain and cloth became sites where new languages and legal practices seeped into routines. Imperial economies prized regular flows of coin, of tribute, of raw materials, and the incentives built into those flows reshaped incentives to move. Resettled artisans might find better markets in a new town. Captives enlisted to produce for state projects might be absorbed into household economies and, within a generation or two, intermarry with locals. Tax registers, when they survive, show the arithmetic of these changes. New names, new occupational categories, entries that suggest deliberate repopulation,
Policies or fiscal accommodations aimed at stabilizing frontier zones. The market's transformative power was both structural and subtle. It could erode local control by making producers depend on distant buyers. It could also create niches where local crafts persisted because they supplied a taste or a ritual that mattered to the region. Monetary regimes standardized some exchanges while leaving barter and customary obligations in place at the village level. Merchants, too, were frequently bilingual brokers, and their role as cultural intermediaries should not be underestimated. They translated not only prices but practices, contract terms, norms of dispute resolution, fashions in dress, and domestic technology. Over time, market integration meant not only the flow of goods, but the flow of ways of life. To understand resilience amid such pressures, we must attend to memory in its many guises. Material fragments, pottery sherds, loom weights, spindle whorls, the broken edge of a stylus, are not merely junk. They are the residues of practice. A particular tempering of clay, a sequence of decorative patterns, the persistence of a household tool form across a stratigraphic break can signal the continuity of a craft tradition. Likewise, inscriptions carved into stone or painted on pots can preserve names, formulas, prayers. Even graffiti scratched in haste can reveal the continuance of a local lexicon when official documents adopt a conqueror's language. Oral forms are harder to recover but no less real. Songs, proverbs, and domestic recipes live in the smallest acts. An aunt humming a tune while grinding grain, a child taught to count using a local rhyme, an elder reciting a genealogy at a funeral. Ethnographers working among communities that remember such fragments often find that what looks like discontinuity in the public record coexists with deep private continuity. Memory is layered. Some elements shift quickly, forms of government, currency, public ceremony, while others are tenacious because they are embedded in daily practice and embodied skill. Bringing these registers together requires more than multidisciplinary curiosity. It requires methodological humility. Genetic curves must be read against the unevenness of the archaeological record. Market reconstructions must grapple with what is absent from the ledgers. Textual boasts of conquerors must be weighed against silence and against the sporadic endurance of local practices. Where they converge, however, the convergence is powerful. A cluster of Y chromosome lineages paired with isotopic evidence of childhood mobility and with a sudden appearance of foreign-style coinage along a road paints a picture more credible than any single line of evidence could alone. There are ethical stakes in the interpretation. For descendant communities, reconstructions of loss and survival touch living identities and contemporary claims. Scholars have a responsibility to avoid narratives that simplify suffering into triumphalist myths of cultural replacement, just as they must resist narratives that treat persistence as proof that nothing significant ever changed. The past was both destructible and stubborn. It could be shattered in public, yet stitched back together in households and workshops. It could be overwritten in law and memory, but survive in the grooves of a potter's wheel, or in the tune hummed by a widow at dusk. So the work continues. Meticulous sampling, painstaking cataloging, careful modeling, always with an ear to the people whose ancestors are the subject, and with a recognition that the archive is partial. We read ash-coated margins and pottery fragments with reverence for what they carry, and with sorrow for what we will never recover. The traces tell of violence and of adaptation, of policies that facilitated erasure, and of daily acts that subverted it. To attend to both is to do justice to a past that was as humanly complicated as the world we inhabit. In the next chapter of this inquiry, we will follow one river valley across 3 centuries, tracking how a pattern of military incursion, market reorientation, and household persistence unfolded in concrete terms. How a pottery tradition transformed its clay and its iconography. How a registry of names shows the imprint of new legal categories. How a few verses, recopied in the margins of a palimpsest, carried the memory of an extinguished language into a new tongue. By tracing these microhistories, we aim to make the larger machine of erasure legible, not as an abstraction, but as a series of human choices, inflicted and resisted, whose consequences still echo. We begin, then, at the bend where the river narrows and the terraces rise, the valley the locals called Aramis, a low, slow ribbon of water that shaped fields, routes, and loyalties. Its archaeology is modest, clusters of mounded hearths and the low walls of courtyards, but the archive those modest things preserve is remarkably telling when read across time. Over 3 centuries, the valley witnessed an episode of armed incursion, a subsequent reorientation of trade, and beneath both, a persistence of household knowledge that kept certain practices intact even as external forms changed. The sequence opens, in our stratigraphy, with a layer of domestic ash and broken domestic ware associated with a polity that organized its economy chiefly through in-kind exchange and local ceremonials. Potteries from this horizon, what field reports have styled Aramisware A, are hand-thrown on slow wheels, clay tempered with well-sorted river sand, walls thick and resilient, surfaces burnished to a dull sheen. Decorative motifs are local, a banded chevron repeated, a particular spatulate stamp on storage jars used to seal lids in place. Loom weights and spindle whorls are abundant. Their weight distributions suggest the same types of textiles were woven generation after generation. The pottery's fabric and the consistent position of finger nicks on jar lips point to a small number of household workshops, probably family-run, where an apprentice might learn the temper of clay from an elder, and in turn hum the same counting rhyme that regulated the measure of grain. Then comes a sharp horizon of destruction: charred beams, a scattering of arrowheads of an unfamiliar alloy, and a scatter of coins of a foreign standard, found, tellingly, in the same courtyard contexts as burned bedding and smashed cooking pots. Isotopic analyses of human remains,
from graves sealed beneath the destruction, suggest a pattern. Several individuals show childhood signatures of regions upstream, people newly present in the valley, while most retain the local strontium range. That pattern fits military incursion, followed by the stationing of detachments and the movement of merchants, muleteers, and tax clerks along the occupation roads. The material aftermath is not wholesale replacement, but selective incorporation. Within 2 to 3 generations, the coinage of the new polity circulates widely along the valley road. Bronze coins bearing a distant ruler's emblem appear together with small, locally made ingots. Not coincidentally, a new pottery type, Aramis ware B, emerges. It is thinner-walled, its clay mixed with a different tempering grit, and its rims are standardized to meet the expectations of market-scale exchange. Where ware A emphasized domestic sealing and local motifs, ware B bears stamped control marks and a new decorative vocabulary that blends local chevrons with iconographic elements borrowed from the occupying realm. A stylized star here, a geometric border there. The potter's wheel is faster. Kilns are rebuilt with partitions that allow for higher, more consistent firing temperatures. The signature grooves left by fingers on the wheel change subtly, less individualized, more uniform, suggesting the diffusion of a workshop protocol perhaps taught by itinerant potters or encouraged by market demand. Yet under these exterior changes, the resilience of household practice is palpable. Use wear on storage jars shows the same repair technique. Internal lacing with rawhide threaded through holes drilled before firing, a repair form that predates the incursion and carries on. Hearth assemblages continue to include particular cooking griddles and grinding tools, even when imported tablewares or luxury goods become visible in elite contexts. The domestic song forms persist faintly in marginal evidence. On a broken rim, incised in haste, a short couplet not meant for display, but for the potter's own mnemonic use. In a jar, residue analysis reveals a spice mixture whose recipe matches one documented in a later household archive. These continuities are not romantic survivals, but practical continuations. Repair techniques that economize scarce materials, recipes adapted to an altered market basket, and rhythms of work that maintain social obligations even under new authorities. Administrative change leaves different traces. In a sequence of clay tablet registries recovered from an administrative house near the riverbank, we see an evolution in naming practices and legal categories. Early lists are household-centered. Names appear with kin descriptors. X, son of Y. This plot belongs to the family of Z. After the occupation, entries begin appending a term, translated in the ledger as subject of, linked to the occupying administration's legal framework. These appended categories affect inheritance calculations, tax obligations, and the public visibility of a household status. The same personal names recur, but their legal implications shift. A man called Beli, who in one tablet is recorded as Beli son of Hatu, in a later entry appears as Beli, household head, subject of the governor, a formula that reclassifies property in ways that will matter for claims and disputes decades later. Palimpsest evidence offers another register of
persistence and change. In a small monastic-styled scriptorium on a rise above the valley, scribes recycled parchment when supplies were short. One such palimpsest, carefully scraped and reused for farming manuals in a later century, retained faint traces of a prior text in an older language no longer spoken aloud in the valley. Multispectral imaging recovers a handful of lines. A short verse, invocatory and domestic in tone, written in a script markedly different from the later scribe's hand. In the margins, in a later hand, a translation is supplied into the new lingua franca and annotated with an explanation: old household blessing repeated at threshing. That marginal note is telling. The verse itself migrates from a liturgical or vernacular space into a new linguistic environment, and its survival is mediated by the utility it has in household practice. It is not elite literature that preserved it, but the practical need for a blessing over food and threshing, an act repeated each season by women and men in the courtyard. The human contours of these processes become most vivid when we can follow recurring identifiers across different data sets. Take, for instance, a potter whose hand is recognizable across kilns, and whose family name, rendered in the tablets as Asim son of Hatu, appears in both household inventories and in signatures incised on vessel bases. Asim's early vessels belong to ware A. Later ones show the new temper. Chemical analysis of the clay sources indicates a shift in his production. Initially, he drew clay from a marshy deposit near the eastern bend. Later, his vessels contain clay from a pit nearer the main road. Why the change? Perhaps the older pit was lost to marsh drainage after the incursion. Perhaps taxes made the nearer deposit more economical. Perhaps caravan demand called for lighter jugs. We cannot know definitively, but the convergence of evidence, tablet records showing a minor land loss, isotopic signatures of traded goods in domestic assemblages, hearth deposits indicating modified fuel use, allows a plausible reconstruction. Asim adapted, altering his raw material source and retooling his kilns to meet shifting market pressures, while continuing to teach his daughter the same repair stitch for cracked jars. Resistance and accommodation are not binary. In these archives, they coexist. A child might be baptized into a new polity's calendar, but taught to count with an ancestral rhyme. A household might pay taxes in the occupying ruler's coin, while preserving household worship performed in a language little used in public registers. Small acts of subversion appear in the margins and in craft. A scribe newly employed by the administration might, when copying official decrees in the new script, habitually add a short blessing in an older idiom at the bottom of the tablet, an almost invisible assertion of continuity. Potters might hide an old emblem beneath a newly fashionable border, a private signature preserved on the vessel's interior, only visible when the vessel is emptied. These micro-level continuities have consequences for how identities endure. Names, for example, continue to be chosen.
From local anthroponymic pools, even as legal affixation changes. The persistence of certain personal names across centuries suggests an unbroken cultural memory transmitted within families. That memory is not immune to influence. Loan names arrive. Vacillaphoric epithets become common among those who seek favor with new elites, but the core remains. The material trace of that memory often survives in the grooves of objects. A clay recipe carried from mother to daughter, a pattern of textile dyeing retained in the distribution of anthraquinone residues, the stamped control marks that, when overlaid across time, show both adoption and local reinterpretation. Finally, moral complexity surfaces in the ways narratives about the valley are told and contested by living descendants. In recent decades, field projects have included oral history interviews with communities who live on the valley slopes. Their accounts do not map neatly onto the archaeological ledger. For them, the episode of incursion is not a sterile layer in a stratigraphy, but a story of kin lost, of fields abandoned and later recovered, of songs that mutated in exile and returned. When scholars write, there is a responsibility to allow those stories to shadow reconstruction without subsuming them. The palimpsest versus a textual artifact. For some elders, it is a living blessing whose meaning is bound up with memory of grandparents who crossed borders and carried jars of seed. This valley case compels an interpretive posture that is attentive to scale and to the heterogeneity of change. Militaries and markets can alter public practices and forms, coins, legal formulas, standard wares. But households, through everyday skills and habitual acts, retain cores of practice that are not easily erased. At the level of craft and language, continuity often exploits marginal spaces.
the underside of a jar, the margin of a codex, the repair stitch hidden beneath a spout. Read together, the pottery fabrics, the isotopes, the tablets, the palimpsest, and the oral testimonies, these traces produce a multi-voiced narrative of both imposition and endurance, of rupture and the stubborn small-scale acts that reweave social life. In the chapters that follow, we will trace similar entanglements in neighboring valleys, compare the pace and direction of change across different road networks and riverine ecologies, and examine how the archaeological record records not simply events, but the moral landscape of choices by people living under pressure. For now, Aramis stands as a microhistory in which the larger processes of erasure and persistence become humanly legible. Conquest arrives with coin and decree, markets reshape forms, yet a potter's daughter still learns the old repair, a scribe's marginal note preserves an extinct tongue, and a household blessing survives, tucked into a palimpsest, ready to be read again by those who remember how to see it.